So let's now learn about the bind method. And just like the call method, bind also allows us to manually set the disk keyword for any function call. Now the difference is that bind does not immediately call the function. Instead, it returns a new function where the disk keyword is bound. So it's set to whatever value we pass into bind. So let's continue with our airline example from the previous lecture here. And now let's say that we need to use the book function for Eurowings all the time. So remember, we have this Eurowings object, and then we used book.call to use the book function with Eurowings set to the disk keyword. So that's what we did in the last lecture. So let me just copy this code here. But now, as I said, we can use the bind method to create a new function with the disk keyword also set to Eurowings. All right. So again, this will not call the book function. Instead, it will return a new function where the disk keyword will always be set to Eurowings. And so let's create a new function here called book EW, which is the code of Eurowings. All right. And so now let's use this function. So book EW Stephen Williams, and we're missing the flight number here. So 23. And so as you see, this now looks like the normal book function call again. And that's because this function here already has the disk keyword set in stone, basically. And so here, of course, we no longer need to specify the disk keyword again. So the signature here, so the name of the parameters, is back to being simply the flight number and the passenger name. Okay, and so now again we see that Stephen booked a seat on Eurowings flight EW23. And so that worked perfectly. Let's also, of course, see the object again. So with all the bookings, and indeed, here is Stephen Williams in the flight that we just booked. Great. So this is really, really useful. And we could now, of course, go ahead and do the same for all the airlines. So creating one booking function for each of the airlines. And this then makes it a little bit easier to book a flight for each of the airlines if we have to do it multiple times. So instead of having to use a call all the time, we can just do bind once. So defining the disk keyword once, like this, and from there on, we can then always use these functions. .bind, and this one, Swiss. All right. Now, I'm not going to use them all here now, because we already know how that works. All right. So this is great, but we can actually take this even further. So in the call method, we can pass multiple arguments here beside the disk keyword, right? And so in the bind method, we can actually do the same. And then all of these arguments will also be basically set in stone. So they will be defined, and the function will then always be called with these same arguments. For example, we could use bind to create a function for one specific airline and a specific flight number. So let's say book EW, just like we had here, but then really specific only for flight 23. So that would be book.bind. And then of course we have to again define Eurowings, but then we can start defining the list of arguments or the list of parameters and setting the first one to 23. Okay. And so if we look at our bind function now, remember that it needs the flight number and the name. But now in our book EW23 function, it is as if this first argument was already set. And so our remaining function now only needs the name. So this function, this one now only needs the name, because the number was already preset here in the bind method. So let's see. So our newly created function book EW23. And let's now book a flight for myself. And let's book a flight for Martha, let's say Cooper. And yeah, let's check out our output here. And so these are the two. And indeed, both of them are for Eurowings flight EW23. All right. And so that's exactly what we were expecting. Again, because we preset that 23 right here. If we preset this here to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then of course, both of these new flights here would be booked onto that flight number. Okay, so this allows us to set in stone certain arguments, and so this function, the resulting function, then becomes even simpler. So right now, all we need to pass in is the passenger name, right? And then everything else basically happens automatically. And taking this even further, we could even define the passenger name here, for example, like this. And then this function would always book a flight for Jonas on flight 23. But that would probably take it a little bit too far. Oh, and I deleted the 23 here. Of course, I didn't want that. So this is correct. And by the way, what we did here, so basically specifying parts of the argument beforehand, is actually a common pattern called partial application. So essentially, partial application means that a part of the arguments of the original function are already applied. So which means already set. And so that's exactly what the book EW23 function is, right? It's essentially the book function, but with 23 already predefined. Great. So hopefully this was a nice example for you to understand the call, apply, and bind methods. But there are also other situations in which we can use the bind method and where it is very useful. And one example of that is when we use objects together with event listeners. So let's write that here actually. With event listeners. And so now this button here will finally come into play, and maybe you've been wondering about that. But let's start by adding a new property only to the Lufthansa object. And let's set it to 300. So meaning that this company has 300 planes. And then we also add a new method only to the Lufthansa object, which is to buy a new plane. So function, and now what we want to do is this dot planes plus plus. So essentially we want to add a new plane whenever we click on this button. So eventually that's what we will want to do. And then let's also log this dot planes to the console, and probably we should also log the this keyword to the console as well. And now let's actually attach our event handler to this element. Let's inspect it here. Okay, should need to go to elements. So this is the button here, and it has the class by. So document.query selector .by, add event listener for click. And then the second argument, as you already know, is the handler function. So add event listener here is the higher order function which receives a callback function. And so that should be Lufthansa.byPlane. .byPlane. All right, so essentially this function here is what we want to happen, which again takes the current number of planes and increases it by 1. So let's do that. And now as I click on this button, let's see what happens. And we get not a number here. So this .planes is now not a number. And the reason for that is that the this keyword is this button element. Okay. And do you know why that is? Well, in one of the theory lectures, we learned that in an event handler function, the this keyword always points to the element on which that handler is attached to. So this is the handler function, right? And so it is attached to this element, so to this button. And therefore, inside of the handler function or the event listener, it doesn't really matter, but inside of this function, the this keyword will point to the button element. And so that's why this keyword here returns this button. Okay, so here you have yet another proof that the this keyword really is set dynamically. Because if we simply called Lufthansa.byPlane out here, then of course the this keyword would be Lufthansa, so this object, right? Because that's the object calling the function. But in this case, it's of course this event listener function calling this function. And so therefore, the button itself will then become the this keyword. Okay? Here we now see the result of calling this function out here. And so now we started with 300 and it was increased just as we wanted it to be. So let's take this out here and let's go back to clicking here to see the result we had before. So that's this button. Now, of course, in this handler function here, we still need the this keyword to point to the Lufthansa object itself, right? Otherwise, this logic here will not work. So what this means is that we need to manually define the this keyword right here. So right here. Now, how should we do that? Should we use the call method or the bind method? Well, we need to pass in a function here and not to call it. And so we already know that the call method calls the function. And so that's not what we need. And so therefore we use bind, because we already know that bind is going to return a new function. And so the this keyword should be Lufthansa. And so that's exactly what we define. Okay, and now as we click here, we should see the Lufthansa object being the this keyword. Indeed, that's now exactly what we got here. So that's the result of this line of code. And so again, this now points to Lufthansa, because that's what we told JavaScript to do right here. And so indeed, now the number of planes is increasing each time that we click on this button. Great. So we have our problem solved. And in fact, we will do this a couple more times throughout the course. So this one is an important one. And in general, the bind method is something you really need to understand. All right. Now, just one final example here, which is again going to be about partial application, because this is another big use case for the bind method. And in this case of partial application, many times we are not even interested in the this keyword, but we still use bind for this. All right. Now, remember that partial application means that we can preset parameters. All right. So let's start by creating a general function which adds a tax to some value. So let's start with the tax rate and then the value itself. And let's write an arrow function here. And so this works by doing value plus value times the tax rate, right? So imagine that the tax rate would be 10% and the value 100. And so adding the tax to 100 would be 110. Well, let's actually do 200 to make it a bit more clear. And of course, we need to call the function here itself. Okay, so now 10% of 200 is 20, and so the result should be 220. And that didn't work. And yeah, that's because we need to define this here as a decimal number here, of course. So only then this rate here can make sense. Okay, so 220 now. So this here is the general function for adding tags. But now let's say that there is one tag that we use all the time. And so let's create a function for that. So for example, here in Portugal, the VAT, which is value added tax, is 23%. And so we can now use the bind function on this function and preset the rate always, so that it always will be this 23%. And then we have a function which only calculates the VAT for whatever value we pass into it. So add tax dot bind, and then the first argument of bind is the this keyword. Remember? But in this case, we don't care about the this keyword at all. It's not even here in the function. And so we just say null. It could be any other value because nothing will happen with it, but it's kind of a standard to just use null. And now we can set the rate here. So let's preset it to 23%, so 0.23. All right, and so this sets the rate value here in stone. So essentially this would be the same as writing, let's paste it here. So this would be add VAT equals, and the rate is preset to 0.23. So this is essentially what our add VAT function now looks like. Okay? So because we already set 0.23 in stone. So now we can start using that. So this should be 123, and it is. We can use anything we want now, like 23, and so on and so forth. So I hope this makes sense. When you want to do this yourself, just keep in mind that the order of the arguments then is important. If you wanted to preset the rate, then it has to be the first argument in this function. Otherwise, this would not really work here. Okay? Now you could argue that what we just did here could easily have been done with default parameters. But this is actually different, because this here is creating a brand new, simply more specific function based on a more general function, which is the add tax function. And of course, the example here could be a lot more complex too, right? So this really is different, because using bind actually really gives us a new function. So it's as if we returned a new specific function from the add tax function. And actually now I have a nice challenge for you, which is to essentially rewrite this whole example here, but using the technique of one function returning another function. So we have one lecture about that, and maybe you can go back and take a look at that. And then I want you to essentially create a function that can return a function which will do just what this one does. So that's probably really challenging. So don't beat yourself up if you cannot do it. I know it is a challenge, but you can still try to take a minute or two and really try it. If you can't do it, then just watch the solution in a minute. Okay? Just don't use bind, of course, because with that we already have the solution. So use the technique that I showed you earlier with the greet function, remember. And so here you can do something similar. So see you in a second with the solution. All right, I hope you tried that out. And here is how I would have done it. So the first function here, I'm going to call it add tax rate. And I could do this with the arrow functions, but then that looks really confusing. So let's just focus on the functionality here. So this is the first function which only receives the rate. So similar to what we did here. And then what it does is to return a new function. And then this new function is the one that takes in the value. And it will then return, just as the other function, value plus value times the rate. Okay. And so now based on this one, we could create add VAT 2. And so that would be add tax rate and then call it with 0.23. And then let's just do the same to see if the results are the same. So VAT2 and 2, give it a try. And here you go. So the results are the same. And so this add VAT2 is the same function as this one. So just to recap, we created this function, which then returns this one. So the first one is the one that needs the rate, because the rate is also what we used to define this add VAT function here, right? And so the resulting function is then the one who takes in the value. And that's why we have value here in the inner function too. Now this is just another way of doing the same thing, and this is already pretty advanced stuff, really. So absolutely don't be upset if you didn't do this by yourself. But anyway, in the next video, we have coding challenge number 1 of this section coming up. And so I hope to see you there very soon.